Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Pearlman. I am the editor of the Jewish Quarterly. I would like to start by acknowledging the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome you all. Thanks for coming. It's great to be back with live events at Melbourne Jewish Book Week. And I'm thrilled that we have two of Australia's best writers to talk to this morning. So I will introduce you both very briefly. Sarah Krasnostein is the author of The Trauma Cleaner and The Believer, and a recent quarterly essay, Not Waving Drowning. She is a regular contributor to The Monthly and The Saturday paper, and she reviewed The Passenger and Leah Garrett's X-Troop, which we'll be talking about today in the latest issue of the Jewish Quarterly. Gideon Haigh is one of Australia's best journalists. He has written countless books about a wide range of topics: cricket, politics, office life. He writes about cricket for The Australian and The Times, and has written for just about every publication on the planet, including in Australia, The Monthly, Quarterly Essay, Meange and Good Weekend. And
but not Jewish Quarterly, Jonathan.
No, that's to come. He wrote a beautiful piece for the Weekend Australian magazine about Ulrich Boschwitz, whose book The Passenger we'll be talking about today. There will be a Q&A later on in the session, and books will be available for sale as well upstairs. But we're going to be talking, we're going to start by talking about Ulrich Boschwitz, who lived a short and tragic life. He was one of the Dunera Boys, but he did not end up in Australia. And he was a writer, and we're going to be talking about one of his novels today, The Passenger. I will ask Sarah and Gideon soon to explain a little bit about his life and about the book. But I'll just say at the outset that it's a fascinating book that's been compared to Hitchcock, the movie The Fugitive, George Orwell, Bertolt Brecht. It's a newly translated book of an old manuscript, and I'm very, very excited that we're going to be talking about it today. One of the interesting things about The Passenger is that the story behind the book, its provenance is sort of almost is fascinating in itself. And Gideon wrote a beautiful feature about this, so I thought we would start with you, Gideon, if you could just talk a little bit about Ulrich Boschwitz, his life, and the origins of this book.
There's something about the short life, isn't there? The brief life, the compact life, the tragic life, the life cut off in its prime. Ulrich Boschwitz is an extraordinary example of that. Almost lost to time, but rediscovered fortuitously in the last 10 years. He was born in 1915 in Germany. Jewish father, Christian mother, raised a Protestant. The father converted to Christianity. Grew up in a secular household, an art-loving, literature-loving, cultured secular household, and Ulrich aspired to be a writer. He's got all the characteristics of a man who dreamed of being a writer from a very young age. However, once the Nazis came to power and the Nuremberg laws were proclaimed, it became clear that the trajectory of Germany was not promising for people of his parentage and background. He was declared a mixed race alien by his father's Judaism, and he and his mother set off when he was about 17 through Europe, through Scandinavia, Luxembourg, France, Norway, Sweden, eventually ended up in the UK in 1939. Along the way, he wrote his first novel, which is a book called People Parallel to Life. It's set in Berlin after the First World War, and then wrote a quite extraordinary book in a very brief period immediately after the Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht seemed to sort of confirm his worst forebodings about the Nazis. The manuscript is originally called The Man Who Took Trains. He wrote it very quickly, probably in about a month, rather like Dostoevsky wrote The Gambler, or Dickens, I think, wrote The Christmas Carol very quickly. Both of Boschwitz's novels kind of were published but sort of vanished into obscurity. They were published under the pseudonym of John Grain. And as an enemy alien in Britain, he was rounded up along with his mother, sent to an internment camp on the Isle of Man, and eventually he, along with 2,500 other displaced male persons, was sent to Australia on the Dunera. He spent about 2 years in Australia. I think he was sent October 1940. He ended up here, spent time at the internment camps at Dunera and Haigh, eventually petitioned successfully for his return to Britain. In the meantime, he'd finished a third novel, which he was carrying on his person when he was aboard the MV Abosso on the way back to Britain in 1942, when it was sunk by a U-boat, and both he and the manuscript were lost. So I imagine I have a bit of a weakness for sort of lost literature, and when I first read about The Passenger, I thought this was a wonderful, efflorescent, fascinating example. As Jonathan says, the story of the novel is almost as fascinating as the novel, but as fascinating as the story of the novel is, the novel actually lives up to its provenance. It really is an extraordinary work of imagination.
Can you just talk a little bit also about how the book has come to be published now?
Yeah. Boschwitz seems to have been your classic kind of perfectionist writer. He continued to want to work on the manuscript for his second novel, all the while that he was in Australia. Apparently he composed extensive revisions, which he promised to his mother that he would send with another returnee to the UK. Unfortunately, those revisions seem to have been lost for some reason. The mother never found out the identity of the person who was carrying these revisions. And it's only the original manuscript for The Man Who Took Trains, as it was originally, that survives in the National Bibliothek in Frankfurt. The publishers of The Passenger have established a bit of a specialty in recovered literature from the 1930s and 40s. And apparently, when their publisher Peter Graf was being interviewed on German radio, the broadcast was heard by a descendant of Boschwitz's, I think a niece, who drew Graf's attention to the existence of this manuscript and recommended that he had a look at it. He went to the bibliothèque, he had a look at it, and apparently, he read it in a couple of sittings and said, "This is a remarkable document." He describes it as like a message in a bottle from 1939, and it's got all the immediacy and the hecticness of something that's written very quickly in a white hot period of creativity. It still feels warm on the page. I don't know. What was your experience of first encountering it, Sarah?
Well, no, I definitely had that impression as well, and I hadn't heard about it until we had our discussions, or much, because I had recently had a child, so I was out of it. But it is. I think the comparator that first came to mind was Kafka, a little bit of Chekhov. And certainly Dostoevsky. It does just have this propulsive effect, and it's visual for me, at least. It has a very cinematic feel, these noir colors that are just, all of the grayscale of a movie from that time. Yes. It is a punch in the gut. I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, it reminded me a little bit of. Did you ever see the movie Run Lola Run?
Yes.
It's got that
Yes.
franticness about it. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about what the book's about?
So it's a fairly simple premise. I mean, I think that's where most of its power derives from. It's about Otto Silbermann, who's a German businessman, Jewish, but in his self-concept, he thinks of himself as a German, businessman, landlord, veteran of the First World War trenches, family man, and the war that is about to explode shows up at his door one day and doesn't care about any of that. And he flees from the, stormtroopers or thugs that are literally invading his apartment. And the only place that he can find any respite is train platforms and train carriages. And he crisscrosses the country on this absurd trajectory to nowhere. And we're privy to, his internal rumination of how could this be happening? In my civilized time in this country, here we are. How is it possible? It can't be possible. It is possible. I have to get on another train. I'll go to this cafe. I have to get back to the train station. And it is so inward in that kind of bringing the reader into that I identified it as traumatic rumination, but that psychological process, it is utterly gripping, which is a word that's misused, I think, a lot with literature, but in this case it is absolutely applicable.
I don't know how much we know about how true to life it was, or how much of it was based on fact at all. But I was, and Gideon, maybe you can shed some light on that. But I was also interested in one element that seemed to change between the narrator and Boschwitz is that Boschwitz I don't think identified as Jewish, and the narrator is very secular, yes. but is Jewish. And I was just wondering about that change and why Boschwitz might have made it.
Well, he's at war with his patrimony, isn't he? Silbermann. He cannot help but acknowledge his Jewishness, but he deeply resents it at other stages. It's his Jewishness that's exposed him to this danger. There's that scene on one particular train journey where he sees there are lots of Jews around, and he curses them. He execrates them. It's all because of you people that I'm in the kind of trouble that I am. So it's a classically ambivalent embrace of his co-religionists. It's also extremely prophetic. It's almost a bit of a misconception to call this Holocaust fiction because it's well before the Holocaust. It's inspired by the Kristallnacht. It's anticipatory of the dread that Jews felt in Germany in 1938 about what might be coming. You could see the outlines of a pogrom. In fact, it turned out to be the mother of all pogroms. But there are passages in the novel where he contemplates the possible future fate of Judaism in Germany, and it's terrifying. Yeah.
And I think, if I can just add, that idea that it's alien to him, this identity that has been assigned to him for punitive purposes. And the way in which he has these interactions with people who are more kind of solidly rooted in their Jewish identity is phenomenally effective, especially given that he didn't himself identify as a Jew, in that prophetic quality, because it says, there is no us and them when it comes to these kind of reptilian impulses masquerading as governmental policy. Things are not so neat. They're not going to be so neat. This is not just something that happens to the group that may or may not be deemed, blameworthy in the public gaze. So kind of throwing in his lot with, the rest of them, it just shows the barbaric quality of what was about to happen with such acuity and accuracy. It's startling.
And what about the depiction of Germans, non-Jewish Germans in the book? There's lots of encounters with sort of a range of them, and including his encounters with sort of business partners who he's becoming disappointed in.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how he depicts
his in-laws, who basically who provide the minimum of assistance. There are other fugitives that he meets along the way, with whom he strikes up temporary bonds, but he can't. He also feels ambivalent about those because they potentially expose him to greater danger. There's a fantastic scene where he tries to cross a frontier with the aid of a people smuggler, and is foiled in the process, to their sort of the guard's sort of sadistic Leah. It's almost like he's coming across every conceivable encounter that you could have. Different levels of German society, different levels of complicity in the regime. In some cases, people who are just kind of completely blasé and oblivious to politics. But just because you're not interested in politics doesn't mean politics isn't interested in you. And it ends up he's carrying all the while a suitcase of money in which this is potentially his ticket to freedom. And then in the closing scenes of the novel, he loses the money, and he becomes extremely indignant, almost sulphurous in his indignation. And he finally thinks, well, I have to go to the police. But of course, the police are part of the state, part of the oppressive apparatus of the state. And in the end, his residual, irreducible faith in law and order gets him to go to the police, with tragic consequences. It's a man fighting all sorts of different internal impulses, and experiencing all manifestations of optimism and disillusionment and fear at the same time.
How do you think the book would work, or how do you think we would read it if we didn't know its story, if we didn't know the story behind it, and the fact that it was written contemporaneously? How would we receive it? Like, how would it work just as a standalone novel?
Certainly enriches the experience of reading it, but I didn't feel as though I needed to understand the autobiography of the reader. In fact, we don't know all that much about Boschwitz. We don't know how much of it was genuinely autobiographical and how much of it was imagined. But we do see evidence of very rich imagination. I think, once again, it's very important to remember that it was written before the Second World War, before there were any manifestations of the exterminationist impulse in Germans. And there are even lines where he says something like, they will kill us slowly, undress us first and then kill us, so our clothes won't get bloody and our banknotes won't get damaged. These days murder is performed economically. That's an astounding thing to write in 1939.
I think it is, absolutely. And we don't know. This is conjecture on my part.
Yeah.
But it does have the quality, psychologically at least, of long observational experience. And it's easy to think that, when we say it's, prophetic, it's not kind of psychic in its, gleanings, but rather the quality of a very, would say hypervigilant, but an observant young person who had been raised with books and ideas, clocking the society around him and all of the tiny changes that are necessary on a one-on-one relational or institutional level to allow what was about to happen. So I do think, while it is prophetic, it is another point that is, I think, important to make, is that it kind of took everything that would have gone into coming to consciousness as a young person in their late teens and early 20s in the milieu of Germany of the 1930s, and the hypocrisy and the dread and the terror of those tiny relational abandonments, and following it to its logical conclusion as a very talented fiction writer. So, yeah, it just also has that quality.
Extremely ambitious young fiction writer, too, because he continues to toil on the novel after it's been published, which I find sort of evidence of a fascinating sort of perfectionist temperament. The 2 years that he spent in Australia, I was surprised to find, well, not surprised to find, but interested to find that he was such an inconspicuous figure in the internment camps. There is a letter to the family from another hut member to in his I think it's the Leo Blank Institute in New York, which I had translated from the from German, and it basically said that he was always writing, incessantly writing, hardly ever talked to anybody else. Occasionally broke off to play a game of chess, but really, an absolute, a born writer. Eventually availed himself of a typewriter in order to expedite his fiction writing, but he was not a key figure in the camp life of the Dunera internees. He led a very, very vigorous internal life all the while.
We'll talk about the Dunera Boys in a moment, but I just one final question on the passenger. It made me think a lot about how we are going to remember the Holocaust and those days, especially as the generation of survivors and direct witnesses die out. And the book reminded me a little bit of the Klemperer diaries. I don't know if you've come across them, but just that same. There's something quite kind of gripping about reading about these sort of contemporary accounts by people who don't yet know how the history is going to unfold.
Yes.
And the same way in the Klemperer diaries, there's lots of bits about Victor Klemperer, I think, learning to drive, but it really makes the history real. And I found there were moments in The Passenger, kind of similarly, when he sort of buys chewing gum on the train station platform because he's a little bit nervous, but then he becomes sort of self-conscious about chewing gum because he doesn't usually chew gum. I mean, I could really relate to them, and I just it made me think that there's an important genre here of this sort of contemporary writing, and I just wonder if you can both talk about that a little bit, about how important is this as a genre, and maybe compared to other genres that we're now encountering, like survivor, fictional accounts, survivor accounts, children of survivors accounts.
I mean, they're all important. They all have their own perspective and their own weight. I would say something like this is particularly weighty in terms of, what we think of as veracity, or having some particular probative value being written at the time. And the diaries that we have, letters, contemporaneous accounts. One in particular, I was lucky enough to read of a family that I know, and they had kind of done their own self-published book of contemporaneous account by a family member, and it had all of the hallmarks of a found work of literary significance. But we're still so early, I think, in Holocaust literature, which might be might feel wrong to say, but when we look at something like the impact that Schindler's List had on our ability to talk frankly and without kind of shame that this was something that we had all brought on ourselves or was deserved, or if we speak about it outside of the community, people won't understand. I mean, we look at kind of the impact as a narrative that Schindler's List had in '94, I think, and the ways in which Holocaust education in the community and externally has changed in a very short period of time. We should be employing all forms to teach across all ways of receiving information. So we have historical, we have emotional, fiction, nonfiction. They all have a role to play. They're all complementary. But I would say that the contemporaneous account, just because how we're kind of set up to look at proof and evidence, those at the time are particularly important, and we need to do everything we can to preserve firsthand accounts, fictional and non-fictional. They're both important.
I have a fear that Australia generally is living through a period of mass forgetting. I think one of the legacies of the last 10 or 15 years with our collecting institutions in Australia is a sort of almost a malign neglect, and I think we're coming face to face with a bit of a reckoning about what we want to preserve about our past and what we're going to let slide.
I do want to talk a little bit about X-Troop, another Sarah, the other book that you looked at in your review. Can you for people not familiar with it, tell us a little bit about X-Troop and what it's about, and I suppose also how it ties into The Passenger.
So, seemingly very different books. X-Troop is Leah Garrett's account. She's a professor at, I think, Hunter College in City University of New York, Jewish Studies Department. And it's an account of this secret unit which sat in the larger scheme of the Inter-Allied Commando units, which was comprised of mostly, not completely, but I think it was like 99% Jewish refugees, mostly German-speaking, and it was kind of intended to train them, because none of them had any skills that would be readily identifiable as, the physical side of commando work. I don't know if that's how you say it. But they had, they were very clever, and they could kind of pass as Germans. So they were trained, these good Jewish boys who, came from Orthodox homes or, very artistic or creative or intellectual homes, were trained fairly quickly in a Welsh town to become the sort of people who could accurately fire a machine gun while parachuting out of a plane. And it was a remarkable trajectory that they had, and they were key in fighting and winning those final battles of the war.
And I suppose the tie-in with The Passenger is the Dunera Boys.
Sorry, yes. So they were many of, the ones that she was kind of lucky enough to interview personally, because she tells the story through a number of profiles of ex-troop, very elderly now ex-troopers. And they did have the experience that Boschwitz had of being shipped out as enemy aliens, and they were his fellow campmates in a Haigh camp. They were Dunera Boys who came out here as well, and as soon as they got an offer that could get them back to England, they took it, unlike what I understand the majority of the Dunera Boys to have done, which is stay and contribute to the life of the country here. The ex-troopers were extremely keen to get back and take any chance that they could to avenge what was happening to their family and friends back home, if they still considered it in those terms.
I mean, it's an incredible story, but one of the things you talk about in your review is sort of some of the elements that can be left out of a story like this. And I'm going to just ask you to read it. There's a beautiful passage in Sarah's review which talks a little bit about some of what goes missing in a story like this. I just wonder if you can read that whole paragraph.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens when you agree to write a review for the Jewish Quarterly is you get sent a little library of books. I don't know if it's like that for everyone, but I definitely received a startling number of books, for which I'm extremely grateful. And I kind of had the delight of being able to marinate in what they were all saying from different perspectives. And, like any writer, I think when we start off having to actually write about something, which is the gross indignity of that, you think, oh, how am I going to come up with something original to say about this, or what do I even think about this? And I had The Passenger on one side of my desk, and I had X-Troop on the other side of the desk, and in the middle were a million books about Dunera Boys and lives and the camp itself. And also a book that I had been reading by a psychoanalyst called Donald Kalshed, who writes about the inner world of trauma and how it has, the effect that it has on the human psyche. So that's the background to this paragraph. This is Inglorious Bastards, but much better, German journalist Norman Ohler wrote about the book. because it is the real story of clandestine Jewish fighters wreaking havoc against the Nazi war machine. On a certain level it is, but if one looks closer, Garrett is constantly returning to the personal traumas underlying the unit Rothschild called a suicide squad. Not least amongst those is the fact that to survive, both literally and in the sense of avoiding the total obliteration of the human spirit threatened by their circumstances, these men had to not just reinvent themselves, but erase parts of themselves. Perhaps if you've already shed the feel of the word mother or father in your mouth, or the contents of your childhood home, in order to reduce your life to what could be packed into a suitcase and taken onto a kinder transport train, such erasure is not what I feel it to be. Perhaps if you've already had your grandfather's siddur, or the violin with which you earn your living wrenched from your hands and thrown onto the deck of a British ship bound for an undisclosed destination, such erasure is not what I fear it to be. And yet, around these stories, the perpetual sense of never being safely one thing or the other evokes a grief for the coherent self that I wish the ex-troopers had spoken more directly about. But perhaps if that kind of deep vulnerability had been more accessible to them, they might not have been the kind of people who lived to tell their tales. Thank you.
That's a stunningly good piece of writing. We'll take questions in a moment, but maybe we can end on that point, and especially since you've both written and been thinking about trauma, and Gideon, you know, your most recent book also dealt with trauma and the way it kind of resonates and doesn't go away. And you know, we're looking at books and narratives that, and I just wonder, you know, in the Holocaust context, in the context of the books, and in relation to The Passenger and the books we're discussing today, if you could just reflect on sort of trauma and how it's remembered and how it's sometimes elided.
Well, I'm concerned in The Brilliant Boy with trauma before it was trauma. When in legal circles it was called nervous shock. And in fact, it still is called nervous shock, which is a strange archaism from the 19th century. The law has really struggled to wrap its mind around the impact of psychological injury. In fact, in some respects, it's fallen well behind medical science and our understandings of how these symptoms can afflict people. I think one of the lessons that I learned in the course of doing The Brilliant Boy was how trauma ramifies through generations. Because if you know anything about the story, it concerns a little boy called Maxie Chester who, 7 years old, was drowned in a council maintenance ditch in Waverley in New South Wales in 1937, and the case that the family court, the family fought all the way to the High Court for some sort of recognition of the psychological injury that the mother suffered. She lost that case despite a magisterial dissent by H.V. Evatt, who was the youngest man ever on the High Court at the time, who seemed to have an unusual sensitivity to maternal suffering, I think, and there are certain autobiographical resonances in that. One of the things that also struck me about the fact that trauma in 1939 found itself so difficult to be acknowledged was that I think that Australia at the time was a nation in trauma. There were very, very few families left untouched by the impact of the First World War. We were just on the brink of a Second World War, so I think there was a feeling of sort of almost premonitory trauma. There's a sense of doom to come, perhaps of the kind that Ulrich Boschwitz felt when he was writing The Passenger. There is the trauma that was handed down in the Chester family from one generation to the other about the loss of Maxie. Maxie's siblings had been meant to be looking after him that day. They'd gone to the pictures instead because they didn't want to be burdened by their 7-year-old brother. They never got over the sense of complicity in Maxie's death and the impact that it had on their mother, who eventually took her own life. So trauma comes in all sorts of shades: individual, collective, and intergenerational. So it's so to simply throw a net over it and consider it to be undifferentiated is, I think, a bit of a misnomer.
This is not responding directly to the question, God forbid, but I just what's occurring to me is that, you know, these stories are so unique in how that kind of nervous shock manifests and doesn't. And with X Troop, you know, it was packaged as this redemptive history and the Jews that avenged the Nazis. Of course, we know that's not possible. We're not going to have a time machine. There is, you know, the fact of intergenerational trauma and the fact of irrevocable loss. But I think that there is a form of kind of a redemptive way of approaching that history. And that, you know, between the traumatic freeze response of the rumination in the passenger and the traumatic fight response of this, you know, suicide squad going back to, you know, fight the Nazis, there is another way of dealing with it, which might be where we're at now that we have fewer and fewer and will have fewer survivor accounts, which is what it looks like this many years later to still be here, to be discussing the things that you cannot polish into a happy ending, and to have, you know, a community and an identity, religious or otherwise, that is spacious enough to let all of the, you know, ineluctable losses just sit there alongside all of the good things that come from, you know, the passage of time as well, which is, you know, not as neat and tidy as, you know, Inglourious Bastards, but it is a different possibility, I think, of what these narratives could look like.
Thanks. We have time for probably a couple of quick questions. Does anyone have any questions? I think you can just raise your hand. Not sure if there's a microphone. Well,
you want to talk about the Dunera legacy,
yeah.
John?
Both these books have in common the Dunera Boys, and just wondered if you could. I mean, I'm sure people are probably familiar with them, but tell us a little bit about the Dunera Boys and maybe a little bit about how they're remembered in Australia today.
I think I'm a little bit older than Sarah. I think I almost certainly am. But my first exposure to the story was the Dunera Boys, the television series, which some of you might remember, with Bob Hoskins in the early 1980s. And it was one of those series that just sort of seemed to come from nowhere. There just seemed to be nothing like it in Australian television. It dramatised such an extraordinary, original, outlandish story. And we owe a lot of that to Cyril Pearl for his original book, The Dunera Scandal, which I think is a wonderful sort of one-volume introduction to the tale. Since then, the historical record's been hugely expanded by Ken Inglis's work with Seamus Spark and other researchers. So there is now a critical mass of material out there for historians to delve into. But I still think it probably still needs a contemporary, single-volume, accessible, anecdote-filled retelling to reintroduce it to a new generation. I think it's a story that's actually waiting to be rediscovered by Australians, which they would now be somewhat shocked and surprised by, because it's actually not. In lots of ways, there's lots of triumph associated with it, lots of memorable individuals, but it is not a particularly glorious period in the history of the empire. It's a really rather ignominious one, and one that I think actually deserves to be told with a degree of shamefacedness by the people who were originally responsible for sending the internees here.
Do you think a history written today would be different to the accounts, the original accounts, or the account from the miniseries?
It always is. It always is. Every generation tells the story from its own perspective. It finds different facts salient. It finds different perspectives valuable. It draws different lessons, and it has different emotional resonances.
Oh, thanks.
Your comment on the rewriting and the perception of the Dunera as being not one of our prides, so to speak, in terms of looking backwards. Do you think that that would be the case, however, throughout the whole of Australia? And that's not a complaint. It's a view of, we certainly have our view, and certainly we've all lived with people who were either on the boat or were like those on the boat. There are others who were not. Others came here through European heritage of other types and in other places. Do you think they would see it the same way necessarily if this was a conversation going in the back of Queensland or in the back of WA or even in the back of some parts of Camberwell or Burwood? Question. What do you think?
I think it's one of those historical interludes in Australia that doesn't fit well with other historical interludes. Therefore, it struggles to find a context. It struggles to find a hook on which to hang it. It doesn't manifest any of those kind of qualities that we like to associate with Australianness. So there's a sense about where do you put it? Is it a sad story? Is it a happy story? Is it a good story about Australia? Is it a bad story about Australia? I think that's what's stood in its path, the path of its potential retelling.
Yeah, and I think we have to be quite careful. Well, you know, as authors, we can never be overly concerned with how our work is received. Good luck with that. But because of Australia's particularly high valency for threat narratives about people arriving, I think there is a danger, not in making this a story, which is we continue to have this concept of enemy aliens in a nation of, migrants, but rather, a big mistake was made because these men were like us. These men are professors and physicists, and they had a constitution, and they had an orchestra, and a horrible mistake was made that the townspeople eventually, cottoned onto, and they'd return every year and la-di-da, rather than seeing the resonances in something like having our first Albo's first boat turned back on his first day in office, and the dog whistling inherent in that phrase. So I do think it has a danger. People will see in it what they want to see. But, we're not so far away from that history of kind of punitive response to vulnerability and need.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I hope one of you gets to write the next history of the Dunera Boys. The books are on sale upstairs, and please thank Gideon and Sarah.